Now, it may be that this new year is one of contentment, plenitude, peace throughout the realm, in which case there'll be no need for my questions or the answers of my next guest. But just in case that doesn't turn out to be true, let me introduce him. He is the king of psephologists, the dean of political science. He is Professor Sir John Curtice of Strathclyde University. Sir John, Happy New Year to you. Thanks for joining us. It's not going to be a quiet year politically, is it?
No, Happy New Year to you too, George, and to all your viewers. It isn't going to be a quiet year politically. There are two obvious storms surrounding British politics. One is the pandemic and the way in which that's going to fall out, and the internal divisions within the Conservative Party that it's begun to expose. And secondly, the fallout from Brexit. And here I'm thinking in particular the fallout north of the border, and that this is probably the year when the question of Scotland's future relationship with the United Kingdom is going to go back onto the political agenda, at least if we do get somewhere towards the end of the pandemic by the end of the year. So let's just take each of those in turn. The end of last year, of course, was accompanied by the substantial rebellion by Conservative MPs against the introduction of relatively mild measures to try to deal with the flaring up of the pandemic. And it's now very clear that however the pandemic is dealt with from now on, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is not necessarily somebody who can assume that his party is going to be with him on this issue, but that actually he is now going to be reliant on the Labour Party perhaps for dealing with this issue, even though, of course, throughout Prime Minister's question time, he has been keen to say, to portray Sir Keir Starmer as Captain Hindsight on the issue of the coronavirus, claiming that he was criticising the government with the benefit of what had eventually happened. So we do have a Prime Minister that, as a result of this fissure within his party, and also a Prime Minister who has also now become someone with whom significant sections of the electorate, including people who voted for the Conservatives in 2019, are now no longer thinking that he's doing a very good job, not least because, again, it gets us back to the pandemic. The allegations and photographs of party-stroke gatherings taking place in and around 10 Downing Street during the lockdown during 2020, and that clearly has upset a lot of people about the way in which seemingly those around the Prime Minister were not keeping to the rules in the way that the rest of us were expected to do so, and that's caused him quite considerable political damage. So the combination of the loss of his electoral gloss and also the doubts amongst his MPs about the way in which he's dealing with the pandemic in particular has created the potential, at least, for a perfect storm for the Prime Minister, whereby MPs who A, doubt what he's doing in office, and B, begun to doubt his ability to help them keep their seats, mean that unless his position is turned around in the early months of this year, in particular by time of the local elections, which are due to take place at the beginning of May, then we may find that much has happened to Margaret Thatcher and happened to Theresa May. We may find that for the third time, a Conservative Prime Minister is brought down by their own party. So we'll have to wait and see, but that is certainly one of the things we're thinking about. Now, meanwhile, of course, north of the border, we have a government which is determined under Nicola Sturgeon, with the support of the Greens, to hold a referendum at some point, and she said he wants to do it by the end of next year. And we have to remember it is a government that was elected virtually entirely by people who are in favour of independence, and therefore almost entirely by people who are in favour of having a referendum. And I think it's probably going to be the case, assuming the pandemic has died down at all, that we will begin to see the first moves by Nicola Sturgeon. She's got civil servants working on developing the case for independence. I would anticipate we might begin to see some of that see the light of day in the next 12 months. And we may begin to see the beginning of what could be quite a substantial constitutional row between the UK government and the Scottish government, a row that might eventually end up before the UK Supreme Court.
As Mr. Macmillan once said, it's not one damn thing, it's one damn thing after another. Now, the virus is, of course, one big damn thing. But that's not the only problem, is it, that Boris Johnson has with his base, both his electoral base, but also his parliamentary base. There are a number of different fissures, differences of approach on Brexit, differences of approach on the Northern Ireland question, differences of approach on libertarianism versus big state liberalism, Greens versus not so Greens. How is he, I mean, as Mr. Wilson said, if you can't ride two horses at once, you shouldn't be in the circus. But he's got lots of horses to ride, doesn't he?
He does indeed. And in a sense, the back end of last year began to unveil the way in which that coalition, which, to give him his credit, Boris Johnson managed to pull together. He pulled together his parliamentary party when he became prime minister. He ended the divisions, not least by throwing out those of the most pro-Remain inclined part of his party. And he then managed to bring together behind his party much of the Leave voting part of Britain. That was Boris Johnson's major attribute. The difficulty, of course, is that once you start to hit electoral difficulty, once you start to be involved in U-turns, and here the crucial U-turn has been not so much the pandemic, but it was the U-turn over the attempt to try and avoid the suspension of the former MP Owen Paterson over allegations of breaking the rules on lobbying. The fact that within 24 hours, the Prime Minister reversed his position on that, and therefore he'd led his troops like the Duke of York up the hill. They'd gone out there and defended a deeply unpopular policy, and then were forced to undefend it 24 hours later. That shook their confidence. So that the lack of now of apparent electoral appeal of the Prime Minister means that, yes, his MPs are now more difficult to lead. Of course, this is a government, but again, part of the pandemic is facing very different fiscal circumstances and public expenditure demands than what it anticipated. This is a government that has already had to say that we're going to increase taxation in order to spend more on the health service and eventually more on social care. And that, in a sense, is a policy that's more or less been forced on the Prime Minister by the demands that the pandemic has made on the health service and has made on social care. Now, I think in truth, we are actually looking at a Prime Minister whose inclination was always perhaps somewhat more big state than many of his MPs, but his big state at least was not necessarily on current spending, which is what he's now been forced into, but on capital spending. All the stuff about improving infrastructure was about capital spending, which perhaps his MPs were perhaps always more willing to follow. These are meant to be designed to improve the country's productivity and therefore improve the way in which the capitalist market actually operates. So he might have been able to persuade them to swallow that, even though perhaps that wouldn't have been many of theirs inclination. But then equally also over Brexit, well, sure, it was Boris Johnson's own decision to do a deal on Northern Ireland that would indeed mean that there would be something like the Northern Ireland Protocol that would require checks on goods going from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. His fingers are all over that. The truth is that much of last year was being spent by Lord Frost trying to undo some of the consequences of that. And it's now left to Liz Truss to try and see if that can actually be realised. But again, that has clearly upset a section of his party for whom, at the end of the day, the union is sacrosanct. And then, more broadly, on Brexit, it's clearly that, some people think that Brexit should deliver a less regulated state. They did have this vision of Singapore on Thames. Whether or not that many Conservative MPs really believed in it, who knows? But anyway, all of these fissures, all of these different expectations, all of these different hopes are ones that, MPs who have, they have very clear views on this. They're now increasingly inclined to pursue their own personal preferences and less inclined to follow the leadership of a prime minister in whom many of them in different wings of the party have lost much of their confidence.
Speaking of leadership, across the benches, the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, he has not made too much of an impression either this year, has he? Will he come forth in 2022 as more of a strong leader, or will he basically continue his path from the previous year?
I think you're certainly right to suggest that, last year was much more to do, or the back end of last year was much more to do with how Boris Johnson imploded, rather than any evidence of marked enthusiasm for Sir Keir Starmer. Now, he has some attributes of value. I mean, he is somebody who people could imagine being prime minister. He doesn't frighten people in the way that Jeremy Corbyn did, at least for a section of the electorate. But equally, the converse of that is he is not somebody who enthuses people either. People are not saying, oh, look, if Sir Keir Starmer were running the show, things would be an awful lot better. He's not managed to generate the enthusiasm and the interest that, whatever his subsequent mistakes, Tony Blair certainly managed to make as leader of the opposition before 1997.
Vote Keir Starmer, he won't frighten the horses. There's a Labour slogan for you. It might be a winning one. Professor Sir John Curtice, we're out of time, but I hope that we'll talk again this year. Happy New Year to you and all your house.
And to you, George.